The first thing Ryan Holt saw was the collar of his own white work shirt pressed against the curve of a stranger's jaw as if it belonged there. Morning light slanted through the threadbare curtains and caught the faint sheen of rain in the yard. He had slept on the thin mattress beside his son's bed, the way he always did when Noah's cough turned hard and rattling. The pillow still smelled faintly of grease and coffee. Now, in the kitchen doorway, a woman stood with the shirt damp at the hem and her hair still carrying the storm. She held a paper cup of coffee as if she had found the comfiest thing in a house that was not hers. If you stay with this story to the end, please consider subscribing and giving it a like. There are more tales like this that remind us how small acts of courage change lives. He blinked and tried to line the pieces up. The night before, the emergency fluorescent light in a clinic hallway. The doctor's quiet mouth moving around words with the same care that people used when dealing with thin glass. Diagnosis. Stage. Hope stretched thin as a rubber band. He remembered gripping Noah's hand and learning something heavier than any toolbox could lift. Then the rain started, hard and sudden, and a dark road, and a collision whose sound had imprinted itself like a fingernail on his memory. In between those two memories, between the cold of the clinic corridor and the stinging hot rain, he had pulled a woman from a car that leaked smoke like a small broken stove. He had wrenched the seatbelt, hauled her through shattered glass, and wrapped his coat around her shoulders until she could breathe without coughing. Now she stood in his kitchen, wearing his shirt, her posture the kind of tight composure that made the paper cup tremble in her hand. She was younger than he had imagined from the picture on the news the night after. Veronica Chase, CEO, the woman whose company was on screens and whose name lived in the headlines. He had seen her at a distance on television, a column of confidence and bright teeth. He had not expected to recognize the human as someone who smelled of burnt plastic and rain, and, impossibly, of his own aftershave. "Morning," she said, voice quiet, the word an attempt at an ordinary shape in a house that had none of the ordinary's comfort. She held out the cup like an offering. Ryan's first bright, practical thought was about payment. The man's economy kept tally automatically. A meal, a tank of gas, a handout. He remembered the wet cash she had offered him in the emergency lane, the quick, embarrassed thrust of bills. He had stood then, hands coated with shards and smoke residue, and slid the money back into her palm. "I did what anyone would do," he'd said, because pride wanted to be clean even when the pockets were empty. "No," she said now, shaking her head. Her hand came to the collar of the shirt as if to steady both cloth and self. She was younger than he had imagined from the picture on the news the night after. Veronica Chase, CEO, the woman whose company was on screens and whose name lived in the headlines. He had seen her at a distance on television, a column of confidence and bright teeth. He had not expected to recognize the human as someone who smelled of burnt plastic and rain, and, impossibly, of his own aftershave. "You sent the EMTs away because you said someone else needed the ambulance more. You shouldn't have." He bristled, awkward in the house that smelled like fried onions and oil. The shirt was a strange intimacy, a white that belonged in an office under fluorescent lights, not hanging at his shoulder. "I wasn't looking for payment," he said. The words felt clumsy. "You were looking out for a kid," she finished for him, and her eyes flicked to the bedroom, where a small mound of blankets and a bicycle helmet leaned against the wall. The name on the license there, Noah, was stitched in bright letters on a faded pillow. "You slept in the hall. You sat up with him all night?" He didn't tell her about the fever that had crept in early that week, or about the way Noah's chest sounded when he climbed in beside him, as if the boy's breaths were trying to slip past something. He didn't tell her about the doctor's phrasing, about how treatment options had felt like a ledger detailing what they could not afford. He let the silence stand, a modest, honest thing. Veronica set the cup down on the counter with the care of someone who had been taught to place value on items as statements. "I'm sorry," she said. "I can't imagine how that—" Her voice faltered. It was the first fissure he'd seen in the facade that news segments always smoothed over. "I came to say thank you, and to ask if there's anything I can do." That was the beginning of the small upheaval. It began with coffee cooling on a mismatched plate, and a woman who did not know how to take no for an answer, and a father who had spent 10 years learning to say no to offers that made him feel as if he were selling pieces of himself. Ryan's life had always been a steady ledger. Invoices, oil stains, school pickups before the bell, the fine art of making a used car feel trusted. Holt Mechanics sat 3 blocks from the elementary school, a rectangle of corrugated metal with a hand-painted sign. It fit like a second coat on a man who liked wrenches better than small talk. On better months, he barely cleared rent. On worse months, the landlord's letters arrived with the polite cruelty of people who had never fixed anything but their own numbers. Noah woke slow. He padded into the kitchen in a dinosaur t-shirt and 1 sock, hair sticking up like a child's crown. He blinked at Veronica as if she were a character in one of his picture books. He fell into Ryan's knee, and the world compressed into the safe geometry of small bodies and breath. "Did you sleep okay?" Ryan asked, because sleep had been a fragile commodity since the cough had begun. Noah shrugged, child-sure. "You talked in your sleep," he said. "You said 'hold on' like it was a promise." Ryan's chest tightened. The word diagnosis lived in the house like a draft. He had tried to inventory hope and found that most of it was brittle and folded into places where sunlight couldn't reach. The doctor had used gentle words. There had been charts and a petition of signatures on forms that asked him to admit to things he felt like he was betraying. Signatures that did not feel like help. They felt like boxes. Here, now, with the plate of toast and the dinosaur mug, he held one small, urgent truth. Noah needed care that required more money than a mechanic's steady, honest hands could bring. Veronica lingered, like a guest who might become a neighbor. She watched Ryan move, cataloged the tools on the pegboard, asked questions that had nothing to do with press releases. Which local clinic took payments on a sliding scale? Whether the after-school program accepted kids on scholarship? Who in the church network ran the food bank? She listened when he spoke about the school bus route and the part-time shifts he'd picked up. It unsettled him how quickly she could be precise about what was broken and how to fix it. The rescue replayed itself in his head as if on a loop every time he looked at her, or the way the light pooled on the counter. The car had spun, a black smear on the highway. Light skittered, smoke tasted of hot plastic. He had smashed the door open with a crowbar he found in the trunk of his truck. Hair whipping in the rain, the kind of sudden, wholly accidental clarity that makes the next few minutes feel more like rehearsal than life. He had thought only of breathing and time and the child's nightlight where Noah had slept that afternoon because school calls had kept them home. He had not thought about money then. He had only thought of the small, private duty of hands. When the news broke the next morning, Veronica Chase involved in a single-car crash on Route 9, minor injuries. The camera in the green room had replayed the salted rain in wider lenses. He saw himself, smaller in the corner of the footage, a dark shape with a jacket pulled tight. He heard the anchor speak of corporate obligations, and the screen favored Veronica's polished half-smile. The footage cut away from him. He felt the smooth, dismissive slide the world had when it was not concerned with the local ledger of hardship. Then, a week later, she returned with a briefcase and a face that had decided it would not be undone by gratitude alone. She had read the small obituaries of kindness in the local paper, the short paragraph about the man who refused payment for a rescue, and she had tracked him down. "I keep thinking about the kid," she said the day she came to the shop, "and I keep thinking about what you said, that dignity is not something you can sell. You turned me down, and I kept thinking about what that meant." Ryan shifted his weight. The warmth from the heater pressed against his jacket. The shop smelled of car grease and coffee. It was private here, and yet, within minutes, Veronica's PR had managed to flood the small place with a reporter's curiosity. She had left the cameras at home, though. When she spoke of donations, she did not have on the armor of corporate language. She had a blunt, urgent way. "I'd like to help," she said. "Not charity. Not a check that makes you feel small. I want to offer you ownership." Ownership? He tasted a laugh that was part incredulity and part grief. "There's a property downtown that sat empty for years," she said. "It could be renovated. I can buy it and lease it to you at fair terms. Or, better yet, I could start a fund, a small foundation that invests directly in local entrepreneurs, people who do honest work. The Holt Fund. It would be in your name." The words had a weight that their small town hadn't expected. Veronica Chase funding a local enterprise named for the man whose hands smelled of oil and whose youth had been marked by scrimping. He wanted to refuse. It was in his bones to refuse because what he had was dignity, and he feared a gift that felt like pity. He imagined the sign, "Holt Mechanics, brought to you by Veronica Chase." He pictured people walking by and thinking of a charity-funded project rather than the store's own slow, stubborn growth. "Don't call it charity," Veronica urged, as if reading that hesitation inside him. "Call it investment in dignity. You run the shop. The fund offers low-interest loans, grants for families when medical bills hit, mentoring. It protects autonomy. It's not about my money telling your community what to do." He thought of Noah on the small mattress, the way the boy had tucked the blanket around his chin with the patience of someone learning how to make the room safe. He thought of the landlord's letters and his own father, who had taught him that dignity sometimes looks like silence and patience. He thought of the doctor who had said the tumor had aggressive markers, and then looked at his hands as if fellowship could be administered through paperwork. "Why me?" he asked, because the gift felt like a question with sharp edges. "Because you didn't take payment," Veronica answered. "Because you treated someone like herself. Because you sleep on the floor for your kid. Because people like you are rare at that level. You don't know what you have until someone else points it out." It took a week of thinking, and a pile of forms, and an argument with himself that felt like a crooked, small duel. He told himself he would refuse, that a man should not be the beneficiary of another's dollar when a wrench felt like a truer possession. But Noah's cough had grown louder at night, like a small animal trying to get out of a closed box. The diagnosis followed him into the dark. Hope, he realized, in a moment not unlike a sudden intake of breath, had to be negotiated, not heroically hoarded in the chest. He agreed, not because the money was mercy alone, but because Veronica listened. She insisted the fund be set up in a way that respected the people it served. No public shaming, no forced press statements, no glossy photos of before and after that would make the recipients feel like exhibits. "Dignity is a condition," she told him. "We can fund that condition." Their partnership began awkwardly, as most human transactions do. Veronica's team drew up spreadsheets. His friends in the neighborhood christened the idea with jokes and a cautious optimism. The first grant went to a woman who had used to run a food cart down by the river and had dreams of owning a refrigerated truck. The second went to the after-school program that kept children safe and fed while their parents worked double shifts. Holt Fund became something spoken of in the same breath as the Saturday soup distribution, and the town, for once, had someone investing in the scaffolding of ordinary life. Veronica herself did not always turn up when the headlines flattered her. She preferred conversations in the shop's messy office, a room with a flapping calendar and a coffee mug from the Rotary Club. She learned quickly to notice the small practical embarrassments of a working shop, the strip of wood that held casters in place, the way a radiator leaked slightly when the weather turned. She would walk the block and notice the need for a new playground bench or the sag in a storefront's awning, and she began, quietly, to act. She sat at Ryan's table and ate Ryan's eggs, the white shirt sometimes stained at the cuff. The shirt was a talisman. It returned to her with grease on the cuff and a smell that said this house had real life in it. It no longer felt like an awkward intimacy. It felt like a shared story. They moved carefully. There were awkward dinners where she would ask about supply costs and he would answer with the blunt arithmetic of someone who had learned to measure kindness the same way he measured oil. Love, when it came, did not arrive in a single cinematic moment. It arrived in the small, cumulative attentions. Veronica rearranging the tools in the shop so that the layout made more sense. Ryan showing her how to crank a wrench without pinching her thumb. Veronica turning off the lights in the staff room and buying coats for the apprentices who began to show up more regularly. The town watched with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity as the Holt Fund's launch date approached. Veronica insisted on a modest event, contrary to the PR playbook that might have filled a convention center. They chose the old community center with a cracked linoleum floor and folding chairs. A banner read simply, Holt Fund. Cameras were present, but not the kind that felt like hungry creatures. Ryan prepared a short speech because Veronica thought it would be fitting. He objected. Public speaking took the same courage as asking for money at a bank, and he had spent long years avoiding both. When the day arrived, he stood on a stage that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old sweat. The microphone a thin black rod that seemed to make everyone taller. Noah sat in the front row, legs swinging, his dinosaur shirt bright amid the subdued jackets in the audience. Veronica stood to his right, calm as a lighthouse. The crowd was a collage, faces of parents whose kids had benefited from the fund, neighbors who had known him since he was a teenager, folks who ran the school's PTA. He scanned the faces, each one a small human ledger of debts and kindnesses. He opened his mouth because the silence had weight, and because he had promised Noah that he would always try to name things true. He spoke about a storm, about the ordinary obligations of a man who fixes engines and fixes coffee machines, about the night he had pulled a stranger from a smoking car. He spoke, haltingly, about the moment when another person's trouble met his own, and how that collision had not been a bargain, but a recognition. "We may be broke," he said, feeling the words as they left his mouth, "but we don't break." It was not a speech of grand theology. He told of Noah's cough and the doctor who had said the word stage like a cold measurement. He told of nights on the floor and mornings of counting coins. He told of a woman who came into his life like rain and stayed like sunrise. The room listened because the truth there was not dressed up. It was honest and a little rough. When he finished, the room did not erupt into thunderous applause. It did something quieter. It leaned forward and held him steady. The media covered it in their own way, sound bites and frames that would be repurposed later. But the most important consequence was nothing that would fit easily into a headline. The fund began to move. Applications came in that displayed neither ostentation nor shame. An elderly man fixing his porch to stay in his house. A woman needing emergency dental work to continue waiting tables. A small bakery that promised to teach apprentices. The Holt Fund's model was scrupulously local, insisting on autonomy and easy access, refusing the patronizing gaze of philanthropic theater. Veronica insisted on transparency without spectacle. Ryan insisted on respect. Noah's treatment began with a small spark of hope. The fund covered consultations that had been impossible before, and a network of doctors came into view who were willing to meet the family halfway. The long, exhausting process of appointments and reassessment was not a single dramatic cure, but a slow, stubborn progress. There were nights the boy's cough improved, and nights it didn't. There were days when Ryan couldn't sleep for fear, and days when his hands could steady a wrench with the calm of a man reunited with his purpose. Through it all, Veronica's presence was not a simple balm. She made mistakes, as people do. She was sometimes too eager to fix with checks rather than listening. She had a board to answer to, investors whose patience sometimes frayed. She had public image concerns that clashed with the raw, messy demands of human need. Ryan had to remind her, gently at first, more plainly later, that dignity could not be purchased with spectacles. She had to learn that not every problem needed a headline to be worthy of a solution. Their romance threaded itself through the work. It unfolded in small domestic acts. Veronica waiting in the cramped waiting room while Noah had a scan. Ryan driving her to the airport when a sudden meeting pulled her away. Veronica showing up at the shop with a raincoat and a grin. the white shirt now neatly folded on the counter as if it had become part of the household. They spoke of big things quietly, the fear of losing what they loved, the hard bargains required by leadership, the compromises that come with blending two lives that had been independently protective for years. Their kisses were late at night, gentle and provisional, the way good things are when they respect what came before. The real climax arrived not in a courtroom or a boardroom, but in a small, unadorned moment. The first time Ryan stood in a classroom as a guest and spoke to a dozen teenagers about the mechanics trade. He spoke of the dignity of work, of the way a hand steady on a wrench could put food on a table and pride in a heart. A girl in the back raised her hand and said she had never thought a man could be both a father and a tradesman, and that both were beautiful. Ryan felt something loosen inside him then, a quiet permission to be known and to accept help without losing himself. Months later, in the slow, practical way lives rearrange themselves, Veronica and Ryan announced that they would marry. It was the kind of wedding that fit the scale of their town. A simple ceremony in the community center where the Holt Fund had first launched. Folding chairs and the same lemon cleaner smell. Noah in a small suit with dinosaur cufflinks. She wore no showy gown. He donned a clean, unpainted shirt. The white shirt motif, so central in their early awkwardness, became a gentle joke. Veronica had kept it, and Ryan had a new white shirt she loved to wear on the days they would make decisions together. Life did not smooth out into a single perfect image after that. There were lean months, unexpected repairs, the crank of bureaucracy. Noah still had coughs that rattled in the night now and then, and there were test results that made them hold their breath. But there was also a steady access to appointments, a community that had begun to expect mutual aid, and the fund that kept channels open to keep dignity intact. The shop grew by one apprentice who had shown up at the door with a borrowed toolbox and a hopeful face. A little blue sign went up in the window, Holt Mechanics, family owned. The words pleased Ryan, in the way a hand likes to find the right tool. Years later, they would tell the story at gatherings, not as a fairy tale in which money solves everything, but as a testament to how a single, uncalculating act can ripple outward. Veronica, once the face of a company whose decisions had seemed abstract to locals, became known for the careful, sometimes fumbling way she learned to listen. She learned the names of the kids who came in for summer jobs. She learned not to foot every bill, but to partner so the community could stand. And on quiet evenings, Ryan would find himself at the kitchen table, watching Noah build something complicated out of a model set, and Veronica would stand at the window, shirt cuffs stained with oil from helping out in the shop that day. Noah would look up, eyes bright, and say something that was child's truth and adult balm. "Remember when you told me to hold on?" he would say. Ryan would smile and feel the promise keep. The storm that had once announced itself like a threat had become a remembered threshold. The night the world felt frighteningly small, the night he had been awake with his son and had gone to the side of someone else's wreck, the night that began the slow, practical return of dignity. The diagnosis that had once felt like a condemnation became instead a catalyst. It destroyed the notion that hope could only be solitary and made room for community to step in, not as a spectacle, but as a scaffold. In time, the town's ledger changed. Where once a single man had kept a household together with stubborn thrift, A network of small kindnesses built a sturdier foundation. The Holt Fund financed more than tools. It financed the idea that people could be entrusted with their own futures. On the porch late one summer, years after the night in the rain, Ryan watched his son teach a neighbor's child how to change a tire. Noah's hands were clumsy and eager. Veronica leaned in the doorway, hands folded, hair catching the last of the day. The sun slanted gold across the town's renewed faces. Repairs, he thought, are not only about metal and fluid. They are about mending the things that cannot be bought back once broken. Trust, dignity, the quiet expectation that someone will show up. He kept that white shirt folded in a drawer for a long time. Sometimes he took it out and remembered a rain-slit road, and how one small decision, refusing to take payment, insisting on dignity, had found a way to return like weather that made the ground softer and more willing to grow. The fund's sign hung outside the community center and inside the shop, a reminder that money was only as good as the hands that guided it. When reporters asked Veronica in later interviews what had moved her most, she answered with a practiced humility. "It was him," she said. "It was simple. He showed me the work of being human without varnish." When people asked Ryan what had saved them, his family, his shop, Noah's future, he would point to the ordinary inventions of care. Nights kept beside a child's bed, the way a neighbor brings soup without asking for a thank you, the slow accrual of small trusts. He would tell them, plain and short, that kindness is a currency that compounds differently than money. It buys things money does not touch. A town that believes in itself. A fund that listens. A child who grows up knowing worth. There were no grand miracles, no tidy endings that erased struggle. But the morning diagnosis that had once destroyed their last hope had, in the turning of months and years, become a hinge. Through rain and repair, through a woman's remorse that became action, and a man's refusal that became principle, the community learned to hold more loosely to pride and more tightly to one another. In the end, they built a life around ordinary courage. A man who slept beside his son's bed when the night was loud. A boy who learned to be brave in small increments. And a woman who learned to let her resources be patient and precise. The storm remained a story they told with measured reverence. A moment when everything threatened to tilt and people leaned in instead of away. In the end, they built a life around ordinary courage. A man who slept beside his son's bed when the night was loud. A boy who learned to be brave in small increments. And a woman who learned to let her resources be patient and precise. The storm remained a story they told with measured reverence. A moment when everything threatened to tilt and people leaned in instead of away. Noah, now older and steadier, once asked Ryan if the diagnosis scared him the most or if it made him braver. Ryan paused, thinking of the nights long and short, the wrench and the bedside and the city lights he had woken under. "Both," he said finally. "Mostly, it made me remember that we aren't alone. Even when hope feels thin, people can show up. Sometimes kindness saves a life. Sometimes kindness saves a town." He folded the white shirt and placed it back in the drawer. Outside, thunderheads gathered on the horizon as if to remind them of what they'd weathered. Inside, the house buzzed with the ordinary sound of life. The tap of tools from the shop, the clink of dishes, a small hand knocking on the table, because the father had promised to teach the next repair. The loop of care continued, a circuit that had begun in the rain and would not end with a single diagnosis. They had lost a simple illusion that morning the doctor had spoken, but in its place a different truth had settled, that destruction could be a door if people holding the hinges chose to open it toward one another. The town kept turning the small screws that made life possible, and sometimes, when sunlight struck the white shirt just so, Ryan could see a line of possibility gleam like a thin silver wire across the fabric. He thought of the little boy asleep down the hall he had once watched breathe as if counting blessings. He thought of Veronica, whose hands had learned the weight of a wrench and the weight of a promise. He thought of the Holt Fund's far-reaching but careful work. He thought of the way community looked in the brightened faces at their center's opening, and he felt lighter than he had the day the diagnosis had hit like the hard edge of winter. Outside, rain began to fall softly, a returning motif that no longer heralded only danger, but also the steady, washing beginning of something new. Inside, they sat together, joined by shared purpose and the odd comfort of a white shirt that had traveled through ruin and into repair. The night was not a single story anymore. It was a braided one, threaded by the simple truth that sometimes, in a storm, someone will come and hand you back your dignity. The boy, now able to sleep with fewer alarms, tossed a blanket over his knees and grinned at Ryan. "Hold on," he said, as if making a promise of his own. Ryan smiled and, for the first time in a long time, believed he could.